Hey everyone, it's good to be talking about exciting things today. So what we're working on today, we actually kind of have a ton of conceptual material to cover, like it's all over the place, which is great. But I'm going to be going a little fast and definitely trying to keep a reasonable time because I do not want to have you be on this video forever. So what we're going to be talking about today is questions and answers. And this may sound really fundamental, like obviously you know what a question and an answer is, but the issue is that as social scientists, we have to have kind of fairly high standards for what makes a good question and what makes a good answer, because that's literally what we're in the business of doing. So you've got a pair of readings that don't necessarily agree with each other on these questions of questions and answers. And you've got, and kind of, they come from very different epistemological positions, but I think both of them can help us get this strong idea of what a good question is and what a good answer is, and kind of also get to see the range of answers people have to that question, right? Which is itself a question. So let me get started. So when we're talking about questions and answers, we're trying to figure out, how do we know what we know, right? This is, yet again, an epistemological question. And the way we come back to this is that the questions you ask structure how you find a good answer, and your answer can only be as good as your question, right? So the kind of first background way to think about this is, how do any of us who are researchers pick what we do? And this kind of can come from all over the place. So for instance, we may see things that are happening in the world, or things that are a good demonstration of a theory, or things that are hard to explain, or things that have applications, right? If we see that sort of thing in our work, then we will be drawn to those, right? So we may, one of the kind of classic ways to talk about finding a question is that you find it in the literature, right? You find a gap or a challenge. So I wrote a paper like this once where, I was reading about a crazy thing that happened in politics, and I was like, I don't understand what this thing is. I want to figure it out, right? So that came from the literature. Another one is the question of factors intrinsic to the researcher, right? People do research. We have interests, right? We have things that we focus on. We have things that we don't focus on, right? So for instance, I speak 4 languages in varying degrees of well, right? The fact that I already speak 4 languages is a big barrier to me wanting to start to work on a region of the world where none of those languages are spoken. Why is that? Because if I have to learn a new language to start a new project, that's a huge amount of time and energy. It's much better for me to keep working in the places where I already speak the language, right? So even though I've never worked on Latin America, the fact that I speak Spanish means that if I suddenly had an idea for a project that I could do in Spanish-speaking Latin America, I would be better placed to do it, right? And in fact, I currently face the challenge that if I were going to be doing any work in Latin America, it would actually be in Brazil, which of course I don't speak the language. So this presents a set of challenges. And then finally, kind of this last thing is, get used to the fact that political science is a workplace, is a market, right? There are factors intrinsic to the discipline. What training we get matters. I had a lot of language training. I had not a lot of statistical training. Guess what I do and I don't do, right? What resources we have as professors. I have more free time than my colleagues who teach at more teaching intensive institutions, because less of my job is teaching compared to them, right? So a higher percentage of my job is supposed to be research. I have more resources, right? If I can get a semester off and get a grant to pay for me to go live somewhere else for a semester to collect data, that's different than if I have to do my work, without actually conducting any field work, right? The other thing is, we have to keep our jobs. We have to get a job and keep a job. We have to be judged by other political scientists, right? So this environment we're in creates a lot of pressures on us to do certain kinds of work. That's partially what Shapiro is talking about, right? So when you're looking at developing a question, you kind of have to move from this idea to a question, right? So the picture there is from an old textbook I used to use for this class. I don't anymore. But it has the idea that there's a broad topic. There's part of the question you can get your hand around, right? And then the broad question at the bottom, right? So it's the vase metaphor. I don't know if I love it, but it's funny at least, right? So I would say what you were looking for in a research question is that you have to be able to connect it to the field, right? You have to be able to research it. It can't be something that's impossible to know. You have to be able to explain how it relates to what's already been done. This is related to the hook in the field. It has to be specific enough that you know what you're doing and what you're not doing. And it can't be boring. And I just want to put this out there because I think some of what's going on for Shapiro is motivated by can't be boring. And I think some of what's going on for King, Cohen, and Verba is the researchable question. They're both addressing different parts of this, right? So that's part of it. And then questions have different types. And this is really important because you're going to need to be able to do this on your exam, and you're also going to want to be able to do this for your final project, right? And it's not that I'm making you memorize these words for fun. It's that fundamentally different kinds of questions produce different kinds of responses, right? So the type of data collection, the type of answer you're going to get from a descriptive question is different than the type of answer you're going to get from a predictive question. So only if you understand that will you be able to make sure that your question and your answer fit each other, right? So descriptive questions fundamentally are about the characteristics of something, how it works or behaves. Explanatory questions are about what causes or caused something. These are called causal questions, and these are pretty central to political science and the social sciences as a whole. Predictive questions are about what will happen based on current trends, right? So it's not so much that you want to explain something that is happening or has happened, it's that you want to say what will what's going on cause, right? So you're kind of looking at it from a slightly different angle. Prescriptive is what do you do to make something happen, right? So prescriptive research, you could think of any of you who've worked in government offices, right? Common task that I see that students work on is they ask them, hey, can you write up a report to say what's going to happen if we implement this rule, right? That's prescriptive research. And the final is normative, which is what's best, right, or ought to be done, right? Normative questions are important. They play different roles in the work of researchers of different paradigms, right? Everybody has normative commitments. How you connect them to your research varies greatly based on your paradigm. And then the other thing is to say is that the research question is related to a broader set of questions, right? The research question is the question you're asking and answering in your study. It should have several parts, almost always, right? And the way you present that question might be as a hypothesis, it might be as a question. Frequent language that I've heard is puzzle, right? Which I like, right? So there's something that you're interested in, that you want to answer this question, right? And the way you present it will be different in a proposal when it's really a question to the results, right? Positivists will give you the version of the question they asked at the beginning because it's their hypothesis, and then they need to say if they proved or disproved their hypothesis, right? Realists and interpretivists are much more likely just to give you the answer to the question, and you kind of have to figure out what the question they asked, right? So they'll give some gesture, so for instance, in my article, the article I referenced that I found in the literature, which was on a particular government decision in Kuwait in 1999, I was basically like, why did this sequence of events happen? Was my research question, right? And if you want to go back, right, that's an explanatory, right? So what was the sequence of events? We knew what the sequence of events was. And then why did it happen the way it happened? That's an explanatory question, right? So I didn't need to do the descriptive work. Other scholars had done the descriptive work. I was able to do the explanatory work. And then I played around a little bit with predictive, right? Well, in fact, what happened is I was writing about something and then related things kept actually happening as I was writing and revising the article. So that was a fun and exciting little moment. So anyway, but then you actually always have a broader set of questions you're interested in, right? So I am interested in everyday politics. I am interested in transnationalism. I am interested in how people interpret the world around them and how that leads them to make political decisions and actions and behaviors, right? Those are the things I'm interested in. So regardless of what I'm doing, right, that bigger literature is what I'm connecting it to. So oftentimes an early stage of a research process is identifying identifying the literature you want to work with and finding a question in there, or identifying the question you have and then figuring out where to situate it in the literature. You can go either direction as you're creating something. The direction we're all told to follow is from the literature to the question. I'm just going to say that very, very frequently that goes both directions, right? You pick your literature first because of a set of questions you have, right? And then you get to a more specific question. So I think this is an endless loop. Anyway, but it's kind of important to get the distinction, in part because the identify the research question and identify the broader set of questions is a question for your short paper. But it's important to be able to say, like, the research question is the specific thing I'm trying to get an answer to, right? That broader set of questions is how I'm trying to connect it to anything else, right? So in my paper that I was referencing, it was this particular 6-month period during which Kuwaiti women had the right to vote. I was not only saying things that applied to that particular 6-month period, right? I was saying things about the fundamental nature of democracy in Kuwait, right? Which then becomes the fundamental nature of democracy as countries try to become more democratic in this particular way, right? So you could see how it was a broader set of questions involved. So Shapiro has this kind of really useful way of thinking about research problems, right? Which is to say he puts them in categories. He has a very strong preference for problem-driven, and most of the article is spent arguing why you should do problem-driven research rather than theory-driven or methods-driven. I both agree with him, and this article is full of sick burns, which I love. He goes after a lot of people in this article, so I'm always down for a methodological catfight. But I actually think this relationship is more complex than he lets on. So what he says is theory-driven work is about proving or demonstrating a theory about how the world works. We have a theory, we go out and we look for cases that fit it, right? Methods-driven is the classic, all I've got's a hammer, so let's go treat things like nails, right? And I think he's actually mostly mad about methods-driven work because remember what I said back on the first slide about the fact that there are disciplinary and professional pressures weighing down on researchers. And the biggest issue with regards to that is that if the research pressures are weighing down on us, you have to pick something that you can do that will make people happy in the time you have, in the money you have, right? Frequently, that can mean using the methods that you already have to hand or using methods that can be done very quickly, right? Or very straightforwardly, or that no one's going to argue with you about, right? There was a time not that long ago, and is in fact the time in which Shapiro is writing against, when essentially, if you couldn't do a quantitative analysis that showed that you understood how to use those tools, you weren't competitive as a graduate student looking for academic jobs, right? So he's kind of trying to trumpet, don't do that thing, right? The last thing is he argues that they're problem-driven, right? Which means that you've got a question or a problem in the world you want to solve. And Shapiro goes all in trying to endorse this as a tactic. And here's my thought on this, which is that, yes, I agree. Our approach to research problems should be problem driven. There should be something in the world that interests you. But frequently, we are at a fairly amorphous place when we start with, hey, I'm interested in a thing, right? And then we have to figure out different ways to address it, right? And so theory often then drives it. And so frequently we can present something as a theory-driven question when in fact it was actually problem-driven at the beginning. Or, methods-driven, right? I'm an ethnographer. That's a methodological habit I have. It's not to say it's the only type of work I do, right? But frankly, if you ask me about a political and social question, I'm going to be interested in what I can learn about it through ethnography, right? If it's not suited to ethnography, I'd pick another method, right? But I'm also more interested in questions that are answerable through my method than I am in questions that are answerable only through other methods, right? I'm fundamentally not that interested in large N quantitative work. I like reading it when it's about interesting material, when it relates to other things I care about. But like, you're never going to find me doing large N quantitative work, right? You're going to find me doing small N, highly contextualized work where I am dealing with people at an everyday level, right? Is that because I do methods-driven work, or is it because those are my presumptions and preferences about how the world works, and I want to understand the world that way, right? All of which is to say, I think this is messier. It's not to say I would never conduct quantitative analysis if I thought one was a good idea. I will and I have, right? But my methods drive my work because my methods are actually about my prior epistemological and ontological commitments, right? Which is to say, my choices are paradigmatic. Okay, I just want to bring this slide back up. We've talked about it before, the distinction between deduction, induction, abduction, and retroduction, right? And the reason I wanted to bring it back up is, first of all, again, remember, you have to be familiar with these terms. You have to be comfortable with using them. The other thing is, what you have to look at is each of these is related to a question type, right? So you can use kind of any form of logic to answer any kind of question, right? It's not that, but you can think about the kind of nature of your question and the nature of your type of reasoning are going to end up being intrinsically linked to each other, right? So for instance, if I'm trying to work through a descriptive question, I'm actually probably not going to use deduction, right? I'm more likely to use induction or abduction, right? If I've got a purely descriptive question. If I've got a purely explanatory question, deduction becomes much more useful because I want to understand theories, right, about how the world works. If I am trying to write something prescriptive, trying to say what's going to happen, then that question and deduction of what would I see if my theory were true, right, is really central. So that's a big part of what's going on in the dynamic. Right? So this kind of way that different types of reasoning are connected to questions, you'll notice that in real life, these come very closely tied together. Part of the problem of asking you to kind of use the methodological frameworks I'm teaching you is that we're taking things that as people actually think about them are like super knotted up, and I'm asking you to give me all the different parts, right? I'm asking you to take it apart. The reason I'm asking you to take it apart is so when you put it back together, you understand how it got there, right? So that's what I'm looking to do. So we get this whole notion of what's going on with questions, okay, but then we have to know how we got a good answer to the question. And it's like, so we're going to be talking about trustworthiness later next week, I think. But this week we're going to focus instead on how do you know you have a good answer as a general question. And the answer is, all of us as social scientists believe that if your evidence is convincing and logical, and you have showed your answer is as good as you can make it, and probably that other answers aren't as good, all right, then you've got a good answer. But we all actually operationalize that concept differently. Operationalization is something I'm going to get to at the end of the lecture. Right? So positivists are really concerned with generalizability, right? Can you make your theory apply in different places and times, right? Can you make it apply not merely to your one case? And you see this come up a little bit when King, Cohen, and Verba are saying that straight description is not science, right? Description is about causality. That science is about generalizable rules, right? So if all you want to do is describe one thing, you're not doing science. You might be building interesting knowledge, but that type of knowledge is not science. This is an attempted sick burn, right? I find Shapiro more convincing than I do KKV, but that's a function of my own particular epistemological positions, right? But they're trying to say some things aren't science. Everybody can do science, but you have to follow these rules. And so they're the strongest positivists will read this semester. The purest positivists will read this semester. And this approach is really about, they want to know, can you develop a theory that is generalizable and testable? That's what science is. Realists and interpretivists both use the idea of making sense of the data, right? In the sense of making something that constitutes sense, right? Realists are very focused on the process, and interpretivists are very focused on the holistic whole, right? Which is to say that interpretivists are much more likely to take on descriptive projects and believe those descriptive projects are worthwhile in and of themselves, right? Positivists need descriptive data, and so will produce descriptive work when needed, right? But that's not where their hearts lie, right? Interpretivists sometimes are like, yes, I'm doing descriptive work. That's it, I'm done, right? Realists are differently interested in kind of this. They're interested in kind of understanding a process and making sense of a process. And a process is, in fact, a generalizable entity, but it's differently generalizable than, say, a law or a rule, right? So we're talking about what different kinds of causality are, right? For positivists, causality is about the ability to test and to falsify, right? Their notion of cause and effect is fairly linear. Causes have effects. Those effects become causes of other effects. So it does, it's not that one thing causes one thing and then nothing ever continues, but like there's something about this. I'm blanking. I'm going to give you written up in class because I don't have it off the tip of my tongue, the 5 qualities of causal research in the positivist paradigm, because it's a useful handle, right? No, it's constant conjunction, temporal priorness, and and logical fit, or something like that, right? So the idea is that you have to know that the cause came before the effect. You have to know that the cause is associated with the effect, and you have to have a good theory that explains why it works, right? Positivists believe that causality is determined through deductive reasoning. There is no other way to get to causality. Positivist language calls causes independent variables and effects dependent variables. Effects depend on causes to exist, therefore it's the dependent variable, right? And experimental methods in quantitative data analysis rely on a positivist notion of causality. And in fact, they're the core, experimental methods in particular, are the core logic of positivism, right? And everything else is kind of seen as how do you get to the level of understanding you have in an experiment, or that when you can't do an experiment, right? So everything else is is trying to be an experiment, right? Again, you can kind of recognize there's one logic with this natural sciences, like you can recognize that logic at work. Realists, right, again, remember, they share the belief with positivists that there's a world we can measure and understand beyond our perceptions of it, but they don't believe we can determine and test direct propositions. Realists are interested in generative causality, right? What makes something happen, right? Mechanisms exist that direct outcomes, right? So there's something that's working. You can kind of imagine a big set of gears turning, right? If you've ever encounter the concept of path dependence, right? Which says A produces B, produces C, produces D, right? And each one of those steps, there might have been other possible outcomes, but once you're at D, you're choosing between E and F. You can't jump back down here to Q, right? That's a realist approach to causality, right? Positivists still want to be able to make limited generalizable claims. They still want to be able to claim that things can happen, can be examples of generalized properties, right? Generalized relationships. They're much more attentive to the rules and limits, and they're much more attentive to the how, right? So positivists are very interested in the what causes what, and realists are very interested in the how does that cause the other, right? Most realists are qualitativists. You can certainly use quantitative methods to do realist work, right? But I will say that most realists, because they have this kind of causal, this leaning towards inductive work and towards mechanisms and context specificity, they're more likely to do qualitative work. Okay. And the last thing here is interpretivist causality, right? Because they're interested in the meanings behind social and political phenomenon and how people assign meaning and use meaning. What we know of the world is what we can study, and we cannot have direct access to reality, right? For a lot of interpretivists, causality doesn't matter, right? What might matter is what people think caused things, right? But it's less important, right? And generalizability is far, far, far less important, right? Less on prediction and more on thick description and argumentative soundness, right? So again, you can kind of come back to a lot more emphasis on descriptive questions, right? Abduction as a logic, right? As opposed to, okay, I have to test this proposition, right? So you can kind of see the way these approaches to causality work out. So I wanted to discuss two of the concepts that are in the KKV material. And unfortunately, I think this is actually in a piece I didn't assign you. I think I changed what chunk of the text I was assigning. And they're parsimony versus leverage, right? A parsimonious argument is an argument that doesn't have a lot of moving pieces or variables, right? If you want to talk about it that way. And it means that you want to explain the world using your theory. You want to do it as simply as you can. Parsimony is really about simplicity. And you want to explain as much as you can, right? And so this is a balancing act, because you can develop a very parsimonious theory that is mostly right, that says A causes B. Trying to think of one that is like true but absurd, right? Like, I can't come up with one off the top of my head, right? But an extremely parsimonious theory doesn't necessarily actually help you answer anything, because just because it's simple doesn't mean that it doesn't take into account all the complexities of the problem, right? The problems we are explaining aren't simple, right? A parsimonious explanation, I can do a gravity one. A parsimonious explanation is if I pick something up, this piece of trash off my desk falls because of gravity, right? Okay, but that explains painfully little about why it falls, right? Leverage, like if we wanted to explain as much as we can, then we'd say, okay, we want to get as much leverage over the question of how does that piece of trash I dropped on the floor fall, right? So, okay, we need to talk about air resistance, and we need to talk about surface area, and we need to talk about gravity, and we need to talk about the elevation of Ottawa, and we need to talk about the way that the gravity of the rest of the universe is attracting us, and blah, blah. No, we've lost parsimony, right? So you always kind of have to figure out how to balance parsimony and leverage in a positivist point of view. And I think it's, because again, your goal is about explaining a lot with a little overall, right? And so you might say, okay, we can't just say gravity. We have to say gravity and air resistance, right? And with gravity and air resistance, we can explain enough of how that piece of trash falls to the ground, and we don't need to pay attention to the rest of it, right? That would be a parsimonious argument with the greatest leverage, right? So I wanted to make sure that you guys kind of got some rules for thinking about variables. Positivists are the one who talks about variables. Notice that I've had this little tree in the corner for this time. So positivists spend their time talking about variables. They identify independent variables, ones that create the effect, dependent variables, the one that shows the effect, and the intervening variable, which is what gets in the middle. Not every relationship has an intervening variable, right? But the idea is it's not that for positivists, A causes B, right? They're not stupid, right? What they want to know is how can I model in a universalizable way the relationship between A and B? And frequently that involves noticing that there's a bunch of, that there's C, D, and E in here, and each of them has a different effect. So we'll talk more when we do quantitative work. This is part of why quantitative work works so well for positivists, is because, you know, it allows them to kind of measure what's going on with different variables. And you can certainly see that in some of how KKV write. You have some advice for variable selection that'll be important for you guys to think about as you're developing your projects for the end of class. But know that this like obsesses those of us doing this research, right? You have to make sure you've got your variables right when you're doing quantitative work or when you're doing any kind of positivist work. Because if you have your variables wrong, you are not going to understand anything. And you're going to have collected all your data and it will all be pointless. This is the hard part for quantitativists. And the last concept I wanted to talk about is operationalization, which is the idea that you're going to develop a concept and then try to go out and look for it in the real world, right? This is very complex, often for quantitative researchers because, or for positivist researchers in general, because what they need to do is get to a representation of their concept that they can put a box around, right? And ideally in a quantitative case, they can assign a number to. And that's actually really, really, really hard because you need to get something you can directly measure. Interpretivists and most realists don't actually care about this as much, right? We do actually care, like, so I want to know how, so this is a project that I am not working on at the moment because everything is paused, but that is kicking around in my head. I want to know how engaging in social practices that are transnational in scope impacts people's assessment of their daily lives and how they think about relationships with other places and things, right? And so like one of the cases that I'm looking at is yoga in Palestine, particularly in the West Bank, particularly in the city of Ramallah. And so I have this question about yoga in Ramallah. Notice that I had to get from how do people participating in transnational practices understand their localization and the way it puts them in transnational circuits. And I got down to what does it mean to be practicing yoga in Ramallah, right? I actually had to operationalize this big concept, right? A different version of me, and this would actually be super fun, would be to study K-pop fans in North America, right? How does your affective relationship to a global community that is not oriented around your culture or language impact how you think about Asia, right? And I have friends in the field of cultural studies who do work like that. And I love it and I want to do it too, but I'm unlikely to work on Korea because I don't speak Korean. See, coming back full circle to the beginning of the class. Therefore, I'm going to end up studying Star Academy or other things happening in the Middle East. No, I'm not, because Marwan Kharadi already did that, so I don't have to. I can just read his stuff. But this is it, right? Operationalization matters a ton and has some very specific forms for positivist and especially quantitative researchers, and is different for the rest of us. There are more of them than there are of us, right? But it's this particular form of how it's going to work. So with that, I think I actually managed to give a lecture of reasonable length today, as opposed to going on forever. We will have plenty more to talk about in class. I'm really looking forward to seeing you guys. I can talk about questions and answers all day. So maybe you guys can come up with some questions for me so I don't just have to flail out myself in class. All right, and with that, I will see you soon.